In this section, I'll be discussing kinship and family, looking at the ideas that connect people together, a sense of relatedness through family. Specifically, I'll be looking at relations in terms of kinship, in terms of descent as well as adoption. Looking also at patterns of marriage, all the way from who can marry, who to marry, where do they live after they get married. Also be thinking about the family a little bit, and then giving some ethnographic examples of kinship as well as family. When we think about relatedness in a general sense, we can think about relatedness as meaning a shared substance and its transmission. This could be anything from blood to mother's breast milk to even more contemporary conceptualizations of genes, or perhaps even other notions along those lines. Also, when we think about relatedness, we organize this according to certain systems. These are what's known as kinship systems. And kinship systems can be defined as social relationships derived from the universal human experiences of mating, birth, and nurturance. When we think about relatedness and who are our kin, this can be in terms of either descent or adoption. In descent, this is a principle based on culturally recognized parent-child connections that define the social categories to which people belong. Birth mother and birth father do not necessarily always correspond with social mother and social father, as we'll talk about. And this is particularly true in U.S. society with the notion of adoption, where you have kinship relations based on nurturance, the social aspect of parenthood, often in the absence of other connections based on ideas of mating or birth. We talk about descent systems and who is related to who and how are relations conceptualized. One common descent system in the United States today, the contemporary United States, is the notion of bilateral descent. And in bilateral descent, people are related to each other by connections made through their mothers and their fathers equally. Sometimes this is also referred to in the anthropological literature as cognatic descent. Again, bilateral kindred are often termed our relatives in North American as well as European societies. When we think about the notion of relationship too, we can think along the lines of lineages and clans, and it's important to differentiate lineages as well as clans. In the lineage context, these are unilineal descent groups, either patrilineages or matrilineages, traced from the person's mother or father, who believe they can specify all the parent-child links that unite them. On the other hand, you have clan relationships in which a descent group is formed by members who believe they have a common and sometimes this is a mythical ancestor, even if they cannot specify all of the genealogical links. When we think about the different types of lineages, first we can talk about the patrilineages. And patrilineages are social groups formed by a people connected by father-child links. Typically, this is a father-son relationship as the most dominant, though female members still take an active part in patrilineages. If we look at Pritchard's work, E. Evans Pritchard's work, in 1940 amongst the Noor, which is a group of 300,000 individuals in East Africa, which was comprised of at least 20 clans, he looked at the clans as the largest group of people which can trace descent patrilineally from a common ancestor. They had a rule of marriage exogamy, so marriage outside of the clan, so they don't marry within the clan. They believe that relationships within the clan, endogamous relationships, are in fact incestuous. The other form of lineage is matrilineages. In matrilineages, the social groups are formed by people connected by mother-child links. The central organizing relationship is the sister-brother pair, which shares ancestral links made by women. And so for men, the most important person in a man's life is the mother's brother. An example would be Navajo head mothers who hold residence right in subsistence residence units, who delegate the duties to leaders of a unit, typically their husbands who maintain livestock and agricultural operations. Now, when we're thinking about kinship and kinship terminologies and defining kinships, There are several criteria for distinctions which are present in different cultural contexts. So there's first the notion of generation, and this is basically the idea here is that you have kinship based on generation. So an example of this in bilateral kindred system would be cousins. Also, another factor would be the idea of gender. So you distinguish between cousins on the basis of gender. So Spanish, you have primo versus prima. Primo meaning male cousin, prima meaning female cousin. In the U.S., we have aunt and uncle to distinguish between the gender. In terms of affinity, this means kinship relations that are labeled according to the connection through marriage. In terms of collaterality, a distinction made between kin who are believed to be in a direct line and those who are off to one side linked to the speaker by a lineal relative. Continuing with kinship terminologies, we have the notion of bifurcation. And bifurcation means kinship terms different for the mother's side of the family compared to the father's side of the family. And we also have an idea of relative ages, relatives who are younger or older than the ego or the person that you're considering in a kinship diagram are part of different kinship categories. Another key factor can be the gender of the linking relative. So you have this in particularly in the context of cross cousins as well as parallel cousins. Parallel cousins are the children of a person's parents' same gender siblings. So this would be a father's brother's children or a mother's sister's children as being parallel cousins, same gender. In contrast, cross cousins are the children of a person's parents' opposite gender siblings. So this would be a father's sister's children or a mother's brother's children. When thinking about relatedness, we not only have the notion of kinship and lineages and clan, but we also have this notion bringing into play this notion of adoption. So rather than descent, you have adoption coming into play, where you incorporate outsiders into the kinship groups. You convert basically an ascribed status or a social position that people are assigned at birth into a chief status, becoming a member of a particular clan or family. These social positions people may attain later in life through the efforts of either themselves or others. And as I alluded to earlier, there are multiple types of parents and children. And so for one individual or ego here, we can think about the genitor as being the biological father, which might be different than the pater, which is the social father. At the same time, you have the difference of a biological mother and a social mother. The genitrix is referred to as the biological mother, and the mater is the social mother. And it's the key part to think about here is that nurturing becomes the key aspect in the adoption bond. So who is responsible for taking care of the children? When we think about family and the creation of family, we think about the notion of marriage. Families, and household formations are important patterns towards understanding the economic and political exchanges between kinship groups. Now, a prototypical marriage does a number of things. First, it's going to transform the status of participants. It's usually a ritualized event. They enter into the ritual as single individuals during the ritual context. They become married, reincorporated into society, and recognized as a married couple, so that their status is transformed. It also carries implications about permitted sexual access, and this is something that has changed throughout the history of the United States. The notion of rape within marriage emerging. So the implications of permitted sexual access. However, still now we have this notion of consent being required in the context of marriage. It also perpetuates social patterns through forming this bond, which allows for the birth of offspring. And it also creates relationships between the kin of both partners and is symbolically marked, again, through some sort of ceremony or acknowledgement. And it's really a connection not only between two individuals, but two families, or in some instances, clans as well. So the question is, who are you going to marry? And marriage embeds human mating with an elaborately constructed social and cultural niche. And so if we think about relationships, we think about affinal relationships or kinship connections through marriage or affinity, and consanguineal relationships based on descent. These relationships form based on matchmaking patterns such as endogamy, which is marriage within a defined group, within a defined social group, and exogamy, or marriage outside a defined social group. As we mentioned before, there's nurturance based on lineage. In the U.S., we have exogamy with close kin. You're not going to marry your close kin. But there's typically endogamy in the U.S. if you look at marriage patterns within the context of ethnic, racial, religious, and social group background. So after a couple is married, there's the question of where they end up living. And there's a number of different forms for this. First is to establish a new residence, independent of either of the marriage partners' families. This is what's known as a neolocal residence. On the other hand, you can have patrilocal residence, where a married couple lives with or near the husband's father. And this is common in herding and farming societies, where there's greater dependence on tasks carried out by groups of men. You can also have matrilocal residence, where the married couple lives with or near the wife's mother, which is common in groups practicing extensive agriculture, or avunculocal residence, where a married couple lives with or near the husband's mother's brother. Another key consideration in marriage patterns is how many people are you going to marry. And in the U.S. today, we have a practice of serial monogamy, which is marriage, a pattern in which a person be married to one spouse at a time. Prior, this has been monogamy for a lifetime commitment. Now, really, a trend emerging seems to be serial monogamy with the increased divorce rates. This monogamy is practiced in most industrialized nations. And on the other hand, you have polygamy, which is against the law in some of these industrialized nations, which is a marriage pattern in which a person may be married to more than one spouse at a time. There's a couple different types. You have polygyny and polyandry. Polygyny, a man may be married to more than one wife at a time, whereas polyandry, a marriage pattern in which a woman may be married to more than one husband at a time. You can also have within polyandry a type called fraternal polyandry, which is practiced in some groups in Nepal and Tibet, where a group of brothers is married to one woman. Marriage can be quite costly for any of you that have attended marriage ceremonies. In cross-cultural contexts, we have what are referred to as bride wealth as well as dowry. Bride wealth can be thought about as the transfer of certain symbolically important goods from the family of the groom to the family of the bride on the occasion of their marriage. This can be looked at as compensation for loss of women's labor and childbearing capacities. And traditionally, the goods transferred may include things in different cultural contexts, such as shell ornaments, ivory tusks, brass gongs, bird feathers, cotton cloth, and animals. In terms of dowry, dowry is wealth transferred usually from the parents to their daughter at the time of marriage, found in agricultural societies in Europe, Asia, as well as some parts of Africa. It could be considered as a woman's inheritance and a way for her to maintain her accustomed lifestyle when joining a new household. In India, this is heavily influenced by commercialism, such as advertisements of gifts from parents to daughters and the demands of specific product brands. When we think about a family and what makes a family or comprises a family, anthropologists now think about family in two different major types. The conjugal family, which is based on marriage, and the non-conjugal family, a woman and her children. A typical pattern which has been increasing over time and decreasing over time in the U.S. is the nuclear family, which is a family pattern made up of two generations, the parents and their unmarried children. Compared to this to the polygamous family, a family composed of a husband, all his wives, and their children. Some important distinctions: a wife has relationships with her co-wives, which can produce cooperation as well as in some instances conflict. We also have this notion of extended family, a family pattern made up of 3 generations living together, so not only the parents and the unmarried children, but you also have parents, their married children, and the grandchildren living in the same having the same family pattern living together. A joint family, family pattern made up of brothers and their wives or sisters and their husbands along with their children living together. Extended families and joint families have specific rights and obligations embedded in member relations that make these forms of families distinct from one another. Of course, families have transformed over time. I mentioned before the notion of divorce as well as remarriage, the departure of children, the breakup of extended families, or even the return of children to households, perhaps after college, with the economy in the U.S. right now. Ease of divorce varies, as well as the grounds of divorce. It might be as simple as saying, I divorce you in some contexts, to being a much longer conciliation practice in others. This can also be due to things like gender influencing that. Grounds of divorce can be varied also cross-culturally. We also have the idea of blended families today, which is a family created when previously divorced or widowed people marry, bringing them children from their previous families. So thinking about some of the ethnographic examples of kinship and family, Stack writes about, in her article, Domestic Networks, Those You Can Count On, writes about the notion of people working in cooperation with one another in extended family relations, both in the same household and outside the same household, to basically provide a mutual support network for one another in a poorer African American community, and looks at some of the factors that go into whether to provide assistance or pull back assistance in exchange of goods in the context of family relationships. DiLeonardo, in her piece, The Female Work of Cards and Holidays, Women, Families, and the Work of Kinship, discusses the third role of women. Women are often referred to as having a double burden, both in the professional workspace as well as in the household. DiLeonardo points out that there might be a third level of work here, which she calls kin work. And so she looks at Italian-American women in California and notes that it is mostly the women who are doing all of the kin work. In other words, maintaining the connections, setting up holidays, feasts, these sorts of things to attract others, invitations, cards to remember people's birthdays, other holidays, graduation, these sorts of things, and that is typically seen as the woman's domain. Scott London, in his piece, Conciliation and Domestic Violence in Senegal, West Africa, notes that the conciliation process can be very difficult for women to work their way through. Generally requires women to have sometimes a year between when they first seek divorce for domestic violence and when their divorce may or may not be granted. It's a very long process. Also, the important thing to note here is that domestic violence is but one of the many issues within a marriage and is generally looked at to be something that is to be worked through rather than as a grounds for divorce. Another piece that you have on Blackboard is Janet Karsten's piece, which she talks about the substance of kinship, the heat of the hearth, feeding, personhood, and relatedness among the Malays of Palu Langwai. And I'll let you guys read through that one. And then Kath Weston, Families We Choose, Lesbians, Gays, Kinship, looks at San Francisco communities and notes that whatever endures is real in terms of kinship ties, that families that lesbians and gays grew up in that might no longer accept them form new meanings of kinship and ties based on the notion of whatever endures is real. So in conclusion and in review, we've talked about relations in terms of kinship and noted that this can occur through either descent or adoption, noting that descent systems can be through matrilineages, patrilineages, bilateral kindred, tracing relationship, or it can also be through this idea of clan systems. We've also looked at the idea of adoption and the idea in adoption of transforming from a scribe status, or what you have at birth, to an achieved status. We've looked at some of the different contours of marriage, including who to marry and where to live after one gets married, how much does it cost to get married, these sorts of things. Looking at families and the creation of families and how some of that's changed over time, and concluded with some ethnographic examples of kinship and family.